play it from my slides, so I'm just going to start that for the first couple of minutes. Yeah, we should be good to get going whenever.
Okay. So everybody I see who's watching the video, I'd like to introduce Karen Adams. She is our speaker today. With that, I'll turn it over to her.
Thanks, Gary. So thanks everyone for showing up today. By thanking the State University support the Master Gardener program. They are able to put on a lot of events like this for public education and public benefit, and it's enjoyable to do them and it's enjoyable to attend them. So I hope you. What we're looking at right is pollinators and all the different kinds of pollinators. It's just mostly some beautiful imagery. When we think about pollinators, we often think a lot about bumblebees. We also think about butterflies, but there's really a lot of different types of pollinators there. You'll see in this video that we're looking at not just insects and birds. Mammals, in particular, are mammalian pollinators. We see ants that pollinate plants, beetles, flies, all kinds of insects help us to pollinate plants. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to slides now. Right here. There we are. So as I was mentioning, we have all different types of pollinators. We have insects, birds, mammals. Each of them pollinate plants that are as different as they are. So all of the different flowers and plants across not only our food crops and flower crops, but wild plants as well, are all uniquely colored and sized and shaped to support specific types of pollinators. Pollination, if you're among our younger folks and may not have a good definition for pollination, pollination is the fertilization of plants by transferring the pollen from one plant to another. And sometimes you can have pollination where the pollen transfers from one flower to another flower on the same plant. But generally, you have to have pollen moving from flower to flower to get you seeds and fruit. It's about the reproduction of plants. And so pollination can also happen by wind. And for some aquatic plants, it even happens across water. But basically, it's the way that plants are able to attract pollinators, those organisms that help move the pollen, so that they can make more seeds. And they package these seeds up inside of fruit or as part of grains that are enjoyed by seed vectors or carriers. Animals then will pick up the seeds that are created, eat them, and move those seeds to new places to start the plant life cycle all over again. So the plants attract the pollinators with their colorful flowers, their tasty nectar, and even sometimes they have an extra abundance of pollen so that they offer the pollen to the pollinator as food. And in the process, the organism gets pollen on their body, and so when they go to the next flower, that pollen gets rubbed off. 70% of the plants on Earth rely on pollinators. So like I said, there's some that are pollinated by wind or water. There are some that are able to be self-fertile, self-pollinizing. So some plants don't need pollinators, but the large majority, 70%, do rely on pollinators to create more plants. of the pollinators that are out there, 200 to 300,000 of them are invertebrates or bugs, plus another 2,000 species that are vertebrates, organisms that have a spinal cord, which would be birds, mammals, and reptiles. So there's lots of different species, lots of diversity. It's not just bees and butterflies, but those are the ones that we know of the most because those are specializing for the plants that humans are interested in. 1,500 of the most common crop species used depend on the insect pollinators, and those crops are things that we use to make fibers and food. We extract oils and make medicines from these plants. So if we didn't have these pollinators, we would be having a lot harder time getting these resources for human use. Interestingly, I thought it would be worth talking a little bit about the phenomenon of humans as pollinators. Pollination can be done by hand, by people, but we're a little slower at it, we're not as good at it, and it costs a lot more to pay a person than if we just let the native pollinators do their job. So a person might get 1,000 flowers in a day, potentially, but a single bee also gets 1,000 flowers in a day. They might make 1,000 flower visits in one day as an estimate. And that's just one bee. So you may have a team of 20 or even 100 people, but in a colony of bees, you have sometimes thousands. And so the bees and the other pollinators are just much more efficient at doing the job that we need to get done. It's interesting to note that in China, they pollinate a lot of their fruit orchards. In Brazil, they pollinate passion fruit. And then on smaller scales, a lot of garden enthusiasts around the world, like myself and others, can pollinate plants by hand to create the plants that they are looking for down the road. So they do a lot of crossing of different plants to create new plants, and sometimes just to help those plants that are isolated in a greenhouse to create seed. So humans do serve as pollinators, and you find that a lot of the reason that China has made such a practice of pollinating their fruit orchards is that they, in recent decades, have been somewhat heavy-handed on the pesticide, and so a lot of their orchards, while they're not affected by the insects so much, they now don't have the pollinators to help them make fruit. So they actually have teams of people that go through the orchards to pollinate each and every flower on a tree. Another reason for pollinators in decline is that they are losing a lot of habitat for various reasons. So, as I had mentioned before, about 99% of the pollinators are insects, and pollinators need to have habitat for food, for shelter, nesting, and mating. But when we do things like plowing in the ground or flooding the fields for irrigation to water them or paving the ground, that actually destroys a lot of pollinator habitat because many pollinators live in the ground, or they live in the plants growing in the ground, in the cavities and in the holes in the reed. With human expansion and human development of the environment, you end up seeing a lot of habitat loss for these behaviors for pollinators. One other thing to think about is that we have seen in the last few decades that weather patterns have started to change. And we've noticed that we may be having earlier springs and warmer weather earlier in the year. And a lot of insects key on to those temperature differences. And when they've had enough warm days, they start to wake up. But the plants that they rely on are very much keyed into not just temperature, but light cues. And so earlier in the year, when it's still wintertime and you have shorter days, the plants may not be flowering yet. So if all of our pollinators wake up before our plants have flowers, then the pollinators are lacking the food that they need to get on. So there's a lot of pressure on pollinators, and one of the things that we are going to talk about today is how to help make space for pollinators and provide them with really good habitat so that they can take advantage of the resources in our yard and keep on making seeds. So what makes good pollinator habitat? Really, there's 4 key components. Those include shelter, space, food, and water. There's a lot of different types of native plants for good reason. That's a lot of diversity out there. And if we incorporate a lot of different plants in our yards and in our gardens and parks and open spaces, then we can support all the different pollinators that are out there as well. So it's always good to plant a lot of different types of flowers. It's good to plant those spaces in layers so that you have flowering plants on the ground level, but also in the shrubs and even in tree level. You have a lot of pollinators that might be specialized for higher up in the canopy, not just a lot around on the ground. They may be feed higher up, higher in the tree canopy. So it's a good thing to think about planting your garden with layers. The ground layer, the herbaceous layer, or the shrub layer is kind of the middle layer, and then the top layer is your trees. It's also a good idea to plant flowers in groups. If you plant a single plant here and there and somewhere else with a lot more space between them, what can happen sometimes is that plant is visited by the pollinator, and it may be a while after that first pollinator takes the nectar. It may be a while before that individual flower will have more nectar to share with the next pollinator. So planting flowers in groups or swaths will help to provide more food in abundance, especially for those pollinators that like very much to focus on specific types of flowers. We like to think about using plants in our yards and our open spaces that flower during different times of the year. So if you've got a good spring flower or a good spring bloom in your yard, but then as the summer moves on and things get drier, if you haven't thought about needing flowers during the summertime for the pollinators that are available, then that's an opportunity for you to look at for planting new plants into your yard. So you should be able to find plants that flower in spring, summer, and even some of the fall season, although the populations of pollinators by the time fall rolls around are starting to get sleepy. They're starting to think about going into their wintertime hibernation for those that are still alive. So trying to get a good spread of flowers from spring to fall supports those organisms across the year. Another thing to think about is that you want to look for plants that will support all the different life stages of insects and pollinators. So especially for insects, their young life stage is very different from their adult stage. If you think about butterflies, as babies, they are actually caterpillars. So you want to have food that the babies can eat. They're not typically nectar feeders. They like to eat leaves. So thinking about having different plant foods for the different life stages of these animals and organisms is also super helpful. As I talked about, the fall is when a lot of animals and organisms begin to pack things in for the winter. They start to find their place to hibernate. And for insects, a lot of those hibernations occur in the leaves, occur in the leaf litter on the ground, or even the standing stems that are left over from some of your plants in the earlier part of the year. A lot of things will find holes in the stems and lay their eggs in the hollows of each of those stems. So keeping some of that extra stuff around rather than clearing it out in the fall helps to provide habitat for the younger and hibernating life stages of the pollinators. And of course, something that's always very helpful, especially during the heat of the summer, is to provide water. And that really leads us to the project for today, which is to create a pollinator puddler. So if you've ever been out in the summertime after one of those rare rainstorms, a lot of times you may come across a puddle where you see a lot of butterflies, or even I've seen bees and beetles at the edges of these puddles getting the drink from the puddle. And that's really the kind of thing that we're trying to mimic here. So the interesting thing is that although we live in an area with lots of water all around us, we have the Columbia River, the Cowlitz River, the Cowweeman River, all kinds of rivers around us. Both the speed of the flow and the depth of the water provide a problem for pollinators. They're not usually organisms that are going to drink water on the fly while they're moving. They usually need to land somewhere safe before they can get a drink. So deep water is typically problematic. What you want to do is have shallow edges or a gentle slope into the water. You'll find a lot of pollinators feeding along the beaches of the rivers, but not in the river themselves. And if you're up on top of a hill like me, we don't have a lot of water since we're at the top. Most everything flows downhill, and we get really dry in the summertime. Another interesting thing about how pollinators use puddles is that they actually enjoy the salts and the minerals that are in the puddle that are dissolved in the water as it sits in the soil there, because those minerals help keep their bodies healthy. And especially in butterflies, it helps to make the pheromones that attract mates. And so providing extra nutrients and salts can add something to your pollinator puddler than just water. So I'm going to switch over back to my camera. And I'm going to flip us over so that we can see what I'm doing on my tabletop as we make this puddler. All right. Nope, wrong side. Okay, so you can use really any kind of tray. I've got a terracotta tray here, just a standard pot tray, but you can really use plastic trays. You can use those little aluminum pie pans. You can use a lot of different materials for your tray. The best trays are those that don't really react with water a lot. So sometimes painted trays can cause a problem unless they've been sealed with a good sealant to keep the paint from chipping and becoming incorporated into the water source. But you can use plastic trays and pie plates and nice terracotta trays like this really effectively. And this one, you'll notice, is only a couple of, an inch or two deep, but that's really all you need. So this is going to be what holds your water source. Now, I like to include a lot of different size grains for the base of my puddler. And you've got insects. This is primarily going to be used by the insects, of course, and they all have different body sizes, different ways of eating. And so I like to incorporate sands. I like to incorporate gravels. And then I have some larger rocks as well. And I don't generally get too large on the rock sizes, but some nice cobbles help to provide some diversity and provide nice little landing pads at the tops of this. And you can scatter them around so that there's a lot of different textures here available for the different organisms that are going to come to visit you. So these different particles will form the base of your pollinator puddler. As I was mentioning earlier, I don't typically like to use painted pots, or at least with the inside surface being painted. However, this, when we fill this with water, we're going to fill it to just really the surface of the pebbles and the sand. And so if you are looking to replace some of these larger pebbles with something a little more decorative, we've been painting rocks a lot lately. There's kind of a thing going on with that, and that can just kind of help provide a little bit of decoration for your puddler. And the reason that I feel better about these is because these are sitting above the water. They're not necessarily in the water, and the paint's not dissolving and rubbing off into the water. So your water system stays fresh, and they can use these to stand on. So another thing that I like to do, just mostly because I like to make it attractive, is to incorporate plants. And you want to think about plants that don't mind having their roots wet. And so I've gone I have a whole lot of moss in my grass, which I love because I don't feel obligated to mow it. And that is something that really appreciates being nice and wet. So you can incorporate different plants into your puddler. And as luck would have it, I have forgotten a knife, but something I like to add is bits of fruit. Specifically, citrus seems to work well. I get a lot of insects visiting the citrus. So I've put apples and things like that out there, but I don't know if the water content might be low enough. They just don't seem to recognize it for some reason. But it's worth trying. You know, you can put a diversity of things out there. I didn't bring a knife, so I'm not going to be able to cut this open. But you can take and cut it into smallish chunks and just put one or two in here. You don't need to overwhelm it. And that should have it set up and ready. And then all I'm going to do is fill the water up. Hopefully I've got enough here. But you just want to make it saturated. You want to make sure that there's water available at the top, but it's not deep. As we said earlier, we don't want the poor little guys to drown. Got a little bit of pollen here in my sand, apparently. And so even this, the other thing you can expect when you put these in here is that especially your sand substrate is going to settle, just like if you're filling a pot. So it helps to have either a little bit more or just have patience for evaporation. Or you can always just leave it and the insects will use the area that's ready for them. And so this gives butterflies of different sizes places to rest, gives bees, it gives just about any small insect that could need a drink a place to rest and not get lost in the water. So this guy is going to be ready for me to take out and put in my garden today, because this year I haven't made one yet. And so that is how you would go about making a pollinator puddler. I don't know if there have been any questions that have come up in the chat, but if anyone has a question right now, I'd be happy to take them. And I'm going to see, Alice or Gary, maybe one of you can call on folks if they do have a question. I want to put my slide back up because I want to make a mention of our upcoming classes, especially the mini workshops on Tuesday.
Karen, there aren't any questions in chat.
Okay, great.
That was fun, though. I enjoyed that. Your puddler looks really cool.
I have a question.
Yes.
We planted a garden in pots up on our porch. Can we put the puddler up on our porch, or does it need to be on the ground?
You can absolutely put it up on your porch. I like to put mine on the ground just because I feel like it's not as exposed to wind with all the plants that are generally around. But certainly you can put them up on the porch. I have put them on, I've taken the pot and turned it upside down to use as a pedestal under my tray. And so, and they're lovely, and the insects will use them for sure. And especially if you're not up here, I'm kind of on the ridge top, so we do have quite a few windy days, but certainly you can put them on your porch. They'll be great. Okay. Any other questions?
That was wonderful. Thank you.
That's great. Well, I want everyone to have a great weekend. Take note, we've got some good presentations coming up this next week. We've got on Tuesday, Soil and Fertilizer Concerns Workshop from noon to 12:30. And then next Friday, for the youth program, we'll be back to talk about how you can garden with food scraps. So planting the ends of the lettuce that you had for your salad one night, or the carrot tops, or saving the rooted ends of your onions to plant for more onions in your garden. It should be a fun program.
The two things that the thing that I would mention is, number one, again, thank you, Karen. Excellent job. We really appreciate you presenting. If you would like a copy of the presentation today,